It's the 10th of May 1993. Thousands of workers are moving through their shifts at the Kader Toy Factory on the outskirts of Bangkok, just like they would on every single day. But this time, things will soon become different in a truly tragic way. What's about to happen will eventually have international ramifications and also highlight just how important proper building planning and fire training really is. The Kader Toy Factory comprised of several different buildings inside of a large industrial complex located in the Sampran district of the Nakhon Pathom province in Thailand. It was built as part of a wave of similar buildings in the 1980s and 90s in order to fill the demand for relatively cheap labor and high production rates posed by international organizations on Thailand at the time. The factory was therefore built to optimize for efficiency and output rather than for great working conditions and safety. And this in turn meant large floor plates with loads of people filling them, minimal interruptions to workflow, and a smooth transition from raw materials over to the finished products. But the fire security at this site had been questionable from the very beginning. And the reason we know that is because the Kader Industrial Company, who owned the factory, had actually had its license suspended back in 1989 after another fire had destroyed its original factory on that same site. The facility had then been rebuilt, and the Thai authorities allowed the restarting of production in July of 1990, less than a year after that initial blaze. But even after that, several other, smaller fires had again been reported, of which one had actually led to substantial damages in Building 3, which was still being repaired when this story took place. After that incident though, Thai labor inspectors had visited the factory and issued stern warnings to the company and had outlined the need for safety officers, more safety equipment and an emergency plan. But work was still allowed to continue, which brings us to the 10th of May 1993. This was, by all accounts, a completely normal day, with workers carrying out their duties in the various parts of the factory. The weather was good, with a relatively strong southerly wind and high temperatures. Now the building we will concentrate on here is Building 1 of the Kader complex, which was also the largest one and connected to Building 2 and 3 in an E shape. In there, the workers and their stations were distributed over 4 floors, with each level handling a different stage of the production or storage. Now, according to reports, there were 1,146 workers in Building 1 during this afternoon, with 36 on the first floor, 10 on the second, 500 on the third, and 600 on the fourth. This meant that the majority of people were concentrated on the upper floors, which is important to remember. Now, the building itself was constructed using a steel frame, which was then supporting the massive concrete floor slabs. It also had internal stairwells and freight elevators connecting the different levels, just like thousands of other similar buildings from all around the world. So for the workers on the site, it wouldn't have felt unsafe or dangerous in any way. But this is actually going to be a theme in this video. Just because something looks and feels safe, it doesn't mean that it actually is. And to understand why, we have to look at several different theories around industrial design and fire protection. You see, all buildings out there really only have one job in the case of a fire, and that is to buy time for the people inside. But that can be done in many different ways. Now, most people think that time is only needed for people to get out, and while that is true, what's really important to understand here is just how that time is used. And the details matter here, because how things are done will affect how a building needs to be constructed in order to maximize that time. For example, if a fire were to break out, all of the people inside will need time for the following things. Detection, which is actually finding out that there is a fire. Decision making, that's when everyone decides if and how they need to act on the warning that they have received. And after that comes movement, which kind of speaks for itself. You need to actually move to get out of the building. But that comes with its own specific challenges that I will soon get to. But then most important of all, the building needs to facilitate the survival of the people who are inside for at least as long as it takes for them to get out. Now, on the face of it, all of those things might sound obvious, but if you think about it, each of those points contain quite large potential challenges, who all needs to be handled correctly, one by one, in order for a building to be safe. If only one of those steps actually fails, well then the other ones quickly become useless. So with this in mind, let's get back to building 1 and see why this would end up the way that it did, because as it turns out, this building was actually uniquely suitable for a potential large fire to erupt. The first floor functioned largely as a storage and packaging area, which made sense since the finished products could then be moved out onto trucks from there and shipped out. This was also the reason why there were so few people working on this floor, since the actual production happened higher up. Now, the types of toys built in this factory were largely plushies and stuffed animals made from textiles, synthetic fibers, polyester fiber that was used for stuffing, and on top of that, there was also a large amount of plastic packaging available. And from a fire engineering perspective, what's important to plan for is not just if the materials present are combustible, which all of these definitely were, but also how they would potentially burn and what kind of gases and fire speeds that they could create. You see, a lot of synthetic materials doesn't char or burn out as natural materials do. Instead, they tend to melt and deform whilst emitting more and more flammable gases, who can then support fire for longer and burn faster than other materials can. This means that once they ignite, they can release a lot of energy relatively fast, which in turn can ignite more materials around them and thereby reinforce the fire triangle. More heat creates more fuel, which then uses more oxygen in a vicious cycle until there is no more material to burn. But that also means that the temperatures can reach very high levels relatively quickly, which will then have secondary effects on the building, and I'll talk more about that later. But in engineering accidents, small design choices often cascade into much larger problems, which we will soon see, but that doesn't just happen at large scale. The same thing can also show up in everyday items, like shaving, for example. Chances are that you are pressing harder than you should when you shave. That's not something you realize when you're doing it, but when you do it over time, this will lead to skin irritation. But the thing is, it's not your fault that you're doing it. It's engineering. You see, most razors have flexible blades that allows them to move independently, and whilst that might seem smart, in reality it will cause some of your hairs to be tugged instead of cut, which will increase resistance and cause you to press harder. That push will then increase the friction between the razor and the skin and lead to irritation, bumpiness and redness. Now, a lot of razor manufacturers try to get around those problems by adding things like lubrication strips on the razors or by offering soothing balms to calm your skin, but that just solves the symptoms, not the root cause. Instead, the real solution is a razor where you don't feel the need to apply any pressure at all, like this thing of beauty from today's sponsor, Henson. By holding the blade and controlling its geometry precisely, this razor cuts efficiently without the need of any force. Henson's razor is tilted at a 30-degree angle for optimal shave with minimal irritation, and it's been engineered by aviation machinists who obviously know what they're doing, because I have used this thing for years and I cannot recommend it enough. So for you to get this last shaver that you will ever need, scan this QR code or go to hensonshaving.com/blackbox and use the code BLACKBOX to get 100 free blades when you purchase a razor. A huge thank you to Henson for taking a chance on a new channel like this and sponsoring us. Now, let's get back to the video and what a fire might do. The other effect on top of the fire in itself is the production of noxious fumes and smoke, which can contain anything from toxins to carbon monoxide, and which will quickly spread throughout the building unless proper auto-closable doors and other barriers are present in any way, shape or form, which in this case evidence shows wasn't. And that's very serious, because in many cases it's actually this smoke that will form the biggest threat to life inside of a building when it's burning. And that detail is important to understand here, because this means that a building can become deadly much quicker than the presence of visible flames might suggest. In fact, we are potentially talking only about minutes here before the effective visibility inside parts of a building might drop down to close to zero, and the smoke could start choking anyone who's breathing it in. This is why when I was working as an airport firefighter, the first thing that we would do when we would reach a potentially burning aircraft was to facilitate the evacuation and to ventilate the cabin using our water hoses. But in the case of a building, this is why the absolutely most critical first part of its fire protection system is a working fire alarm, which should not only react quickly to the presence of fire and smoke, but also sound in all parts of the building. And that brings us back to building 1 in this story. Around time 1600, a small fire was identified on the first floor. We don't know exactly how it started, but it is possible that it was due to an electrical failure, as its starting point was found to have been close to a large electrical panel. But it is also perfectly possible that it was just due to a carelessly discarded cigarette butt. In any case, in the first few minutes, this was still a perfectly manageable situation. But according to available evidence, the workers on the higher levels weren't all notified of this fire, possibly since the fire alarms weren't working properly, or at least weren't heard. But on top of that, some of the workers who did notice some smoke or maybe did hear the fire bell were then told that it was just a minor fire and that they should therefore continue to work. Production had to go on. Now, I cannot overemphasize the danger of this, and this is likely one of the biggest lessons that we should take from this whole story on a personal level. Have you ever been in a school fire drill, or maybe been in a hotel when one of those fire drills have been scheduled? Well, I'm guessing that most of you have, and you've likely also thought how pointless this can feel, and how you would rather continue just doing what you were doing instead. Well, these drills are there for a reason. Not only is it crucial that you know your fire exits and where to gather once you're outside, but it is also important that you can react almost instinctively when a fire alarm goes off, because when you're under real stress and maybe choking from smoke, that is one of the only things that you will have to rely on. That is actually also why we commercial pilots practice engine failures and fire drills so extensively in simulators. That is so that we can, if it would happen in reality, fall back onto a form of autopilot, which largely removes panic and confusion from the equation. The other reason why you must treat all fire warnings as real, no matter how irritating they might feel, is that you in your location might not smell or see the smoke, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a fire. The situation could quickly change, and if you haven't started moving yet when that happens, it might already be too late. So going back to this case, as some of the workers on the upper floors were told to ignore the first warnings of the fire, they obeyed, likely because of a cultural norm mandating a respect for authorities, and also from a lack of overall fire training. So that represented the failure of the first safety barrier, and the clock was now ticking. The second barrier should have been the fire suppression system. But in the case of this building, instead of an automatic sprinkler system, there were only a series of handheld portable extinguishers and hoses spread out along the walls and stairwells in the building. Now that was a rudimentary fire protection system, but whilst automatic sprinklers will quickly react to heat and start cooling down a fire immediately, providing time, handheld extinguishers will depend on quick human intervention, correct identification and proximity to the fire, as well as effective firefighting techniques. And given what was burning here, getting a fire like this under control during the first couple of minutes would have been absolutely crucial for the overall survivability. So, as the fire alarm and the response to it now didn't work as planned, the fire on level 1 quickly grew so large that the handheld extinguishers would have been basically useless. And that in turn meant that 2 of the safety barriers had now been crossed, likely within just a few minutes or so. Up until this point, the possible survivability of this fire had been quite high, but as the minutes kept moving forward, the situation quickly turned worse, and the effects of the fire would have quickly become much more obvious to the people on the upper floors. At that point, the priority was no longer to try to extinguish or control the fire. It was now all about trying to evacuate everyone before the conditions inside the building would become unsurvivable. In fire engineering, that relationship is often expressed through something known as the ASET RSET framework. ASET stands for Available Safe Egress Time, meaning the time between the detection of a fire and the onset of truly dangerous conditions. RSET stands for Required Safe Egress Time, which is the time people actually need to detect the emergency, recognize it, decide to and then begin moving, and finally to reach safety. Now, a building will only be deemed to perform okay from a fire protection standpoint if ASET remains larger than RSET. It is as simple as that. And this framework matters specifically here since this wasn't just a fire in a building. No, this was now a situation in which both sides of that equation were moving in the wrong direction at the same time. On the ASET side, the available time was being cut down by how quickly the fire was now building and how much smoke it was creating. This created a rapid loss of visibility and the upward spread of hot gases and smoke through a building that just weren't constructed to properly stop it from spreading. And on the RSET side, the required time was being increased by the delayed alarm, uncertain information, loads of people on the upper floors, and soon also the progressive loss of at least one principal escape route, since one of the stairwells had quickly become blocked by the fire downstairs. In other words, the raging fire was now shortening the time available, while the building and its management were lengthening the time required. So a trap was basically closing. Again, the reason why this matters so much is that people often imagine an evacuation as something that starts as soon as a fire erupts, but in reality, it rarely does. Required safe egress time is not just the time that it takes to move out. No, in performance-based fire engineering, RSET is actually built up of several components, which include detection time, alarm or notification time, pre-movement time, and then movement time. So what do I mean by that then? Well, detection time is how long it takes to actually detect the fire for the first time. Alarm time is the time it takes for the information about the fire to actually reach the affected people. Pre-movement time is then the painful interval that it takes for the affected people to interpret cues, seek confirmation, collect belongings, and wait for instructions. And sometimes it also includes just continue with what they're doing because the situation hasn't yet been socially deemed as an emergency, which was likely at least partially the case here. So this all means that the actual movement time begins only after all of those stages has been completed, and that's why fire training is so crucially important. Now, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is a US government agency who works with setting up fire protection standards, they treat all of the elements that I just described individually. And that's because modern evacuation modeling literature have repeatedly shown that pre-evacuation delays, they aren't rare at all. They form a very real part of fire incidents, so they must be taken into account. But in this case, they just weren't. Like I mentioned before, while the fire alarm functioned well in buildings 2 and 3, meaning that the workers there evacuated safely, the workers in building 1 likely didn't hear that same alarm and therefore largely kept working, with the reassurance from their managers and security guards. And what that meant in analytical terms was that the detection and pre-movement portions of RSET now got longer, at the very moment when they had to get shorter to maximize survivability. And this brings us to the next part in this story, which is what happened once the people actually did start seeing and smelling the smoke, realized that there was real danger, and started moving. By this point, the fire and smoke had, like I mentioned, already blocked the southern stairwell, forcing the 1,100 people who were still on the 3rd and 4th floor to try and cram themselves down through the one remaining, 1.5-meter wide stairwell all at the same time. Which is where this fire now truly went from a manageable thing to a disaster. You see, international building standards and fire codes clearly state that buildings must have multiple fire egress pods, exactly for this reason. And those also need to be built and sized in a way that will allow all occupants of the building to get out, even if half of the available exits are blocked by fire, which is very similar to the kind of rules we have in aviation actually. This would mean that doors leading to those exits have to swing open outwards in the direction of travel, and they also have to be easy to open from the inside, all to make sure that an evacuation can move smoothly without creating choke points, queues or friction. Now, the first part of these rules had been followed in this case, since there were actually 2 exits, but not the second, as the northern stairwell here was just way too small to accommodate everyone efficiently. So what now happened was that the flow of people soon stopped flowing uniformly down the stairs and instead started acting almost hydraulically. The crowd compressed at the entry points of the stairwell, accumulated at landings and slowed down during the winding turns of the stairs, with each hold point creating a queuing ripple effect backwards, similar to what would happen in queues on a highway. Now, NIST had actually made some stair research, looking at the average descent speed under normal evacuation circumstances, and they had found that it would average around 0.44 meters per second. But they had also found that it could vary hugely depending on the density of people, with wider stairs improving the movement rate a lot. And because the evacuation here had now been slowed down to almost a crawl, another factor soon also started weighing in, which had to do with the amount of toxic fumes, heat and gases that the evacuating people were now subjected to. Again, NIST had done some research here, and they used a measurement called fractional effective dose, or FED, to calculate when the most fragile persons would start becoming incapacitated and therefore would cause even more blockage. Their research showed that a dose of 0.3 FED would be enough, which in a normal fire would take quite a long time to reach depending on the circumstances. But crucially for this case, their research had also shown that the time to reach that dose would drastically reduce, sometimes with as much as 400 seconds, if toxic gases like hydrogen cyanide would be present, which, you guessed it, were created from the burning of exactly the type of materials that were present in this fire. And when we're on this subject, another very important factor when constructing buildings from a fire protection standpoint is to make sure that emergency exit paths are protected from the fire and harmful gases as much as humanly possible. This is normally done through the use of automatic fire doors, for example, who will try to keep a burning part of a building separated from the rest for as long as possible, as well as restricting the amount of oxygen that the fire will have access to. But in this case, reports afterwards raised serious questions about this building's passive fire protection design. And on top of that, the freight elevator shafts inside of Building 1 worked as kind of chimneys, allowing the toxic gases to quickly reach the upper levels. So this again meant that even though the fire and heat maybe didn't reach the people on the upper floors immediately, the smoke and toxic fumes very soon did, likely adding to the confusion and panic and therefore slowing down the evacuation even further. Now at this point, I'm sure that most of you can see the full combined impact of all of these different design choices. The fire had first been discovered at around 1600, at which point some security guard had tried to fight it unsuccessfully using those hoses and fire extinguishers that they had. But without the help of a proper sprinkler system, there wasn't much they could do. Around 21 minutes later, the fire brigade was finally called, but due to the unfortunate timing of the start of this fire, they were then delayed in the typically gridlocked traffic around Bangkok, and they therefore arrived only at around 1640, a full 40 minutes after the fire had broken out. During that time, the people in Building 2 and 3 had already evacuated, but in Building 1, remember, the fire alarm had reportedly not gone off properly, and on top of that, the workers had initially been told to stay put, since it was only a small fire. So by the time that the smoke had started billowing in, their escape path had been reduced to only a single 1.5 meter wide stairwell, all whilst toxic smoke was now entering the emergency escape path from open doors and elevator shafts, soon smothering people in the stairs and in the walkways. All of this meant that when the firefighters finally arrived at the scene, they witnessed people throwing themselves out of windows on the higher levels in order to escape the smoke. And those desperate acts showed that although the building was still standing at that point, the survivable window had likely already closed on the upper levels. But this still wasn't the end of this story. And this is where we get to the final issue with this building. Like I explained before, it had been constructed using steel beams, which were then holding up the concrete slabs around it. Now, steel is fantastic in many ways, but one thing it doesn't do very well is maintain its strength when it's subjected to very intense heat. Now that is of course not news for building engineers, who have to assume that a building will be exposed to fire, and they therefore have to make sure that all involved materials, including the steel, is protected in a way that will allow the structure to stay intact for as long as needed for the people inside to escape it. Now in the case of this fire, given the size of the storage, the type of materials that were burning and the volume of fuel available, it is very possible that the temperatures on the lower floors would have reached localized temperatures of up to 800 to maybe 1000 degrees Celsius in a relatively short time. An unprotected steel will start to lose its yield strength already at around 400 degrees Celsius, with about 40 to 50% of its strength lost around 600 degrees and then rapidly deteriorating further if the temperature goes up. Now, beyond just the yield strength of the steel, there's also another factor that has to be taken into account here, and that's the thermal expansion under restraint that these steel beams would be exposed to. You see, since steel expands as the temperature rises, as most materials do, this also has to be taken into account in a fire scenario. If the beams are free to expand without pushing up against each other or other restraints, the effect of this are pretty benign. But if they are connected directly to columns, fitted to continuous floors, or if they restrain each other, well then this expansion will generate huge compressive forces within the structure, basically pressing outwards in all different directions, increasing actual loads in columns and adding bending moments everywhere. And since the steel beams in this building wasn't protected in any way, nor incorporated in such a way that this potential thermal expansion was mitigated, this meant that the structural strength of the entire building was now rapidly deteriorating as the fire continued. By the time the firefighters arrived, parts of the building had already started to fall, and by time 1714, just over an hour after the fire had gotten out of control, the entire building suddenly collapsed in a cloud of smoke, fire and debris, which finally sealed the fate of any of the people who were still left inside. But like I mentioned earlier, it's highly likely that the survivable window had actually already run out much earlier. Due to the strong southerly winds that were blowing on this day, despite the firefighters' best efforts, the fire then kept burning out of control in buildings 2 and 3 as well, so those now also collapsed at times 1730 and 1805 respectively. All in all, 469 workers, the majority of them female, were taken to local hospitals, where 20 soon died as a direct result of the fire, bringing the total devastating death toll to 188. This made this into the worst industrial fire accident in history at the time, surpassing the previous disaster, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City back in 1911, where 146 people had been killed. And even though those two fires had happened 82 years apart, some striking similarities between them were soon found. In both cases, there had been a lack of proper emergency exits. Automatic fire extinguishing systems and flammable materials were readily available. The workers had also been poorly trained, and the smoke had been allowed to reach the egress paths relatively easily. But there was one big difference. In the New York fire, the building hadn't collapsed, and the reason that the Kader factory did was found to have come down to the complete lack of fireproofing of the exposed steel beams. Now, the fact that there were so many similarities was hugely disappointing because as a result of the New York Triangle fire, something known as the Life Safety Code had been added to the National Fire Protection Association's building standards precisely to avoid a repeat of that tragedy. And it did include all of the regulations that I have already explained to you. So had that been followed, well then the loss of life in this fire would likely have been greatly reduced or even avoided completely. So why hadn't it? Well, there's no getting away with the fact that financial interests likely had something to do with all of this, together with lax local adherence to international norms and building regulations. The Kader facility exported most of its goods to countries outside of Thailand, and it was majority owned by foreign interests. And that fact obviously begs the question whether those external actors were pushing local industries to skirt regulations in search for higher efficiency and lower prices. But no matter whose fault this was, the lesson from this tragedy stays the same. We know how to build safe buildings and how to apply the lessons from previous disasters, but that's of course of no use if the people constructing the buildings and overseeing it then doesn't apply them. If this structure would have had working fire alarms, automatic sprinkler systems and adequately numbered and sized emergency exits, well then the people inside would have stood a much better chance of surviving. And if they then would have been properly trained, they would have reacted faster to the signs of the fire that actually did exist. So as the philosopher George Santayana wrote, and which was quoted in one of our sources, those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. Which is as true in building regulations as it is in my world of commercial aviation. So the next time that you walk past an emergency exit or a fire door, or when you have to take part in a fire drill at work, remember that this disaster is one of the reasons behind it. Now, I hope you found this story interesting, and if you did, consider supporting my team and I by scanning this QR code or by going to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot and sign up. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor's Black Box. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and remember, every accident is a lesson. Bye-bye.